Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel and also to chair this panel. I've had an association with the Dialogue Society going back many, many years, and although not done a great deal recently, I'm always remain conscious of the great work that you do, and if anything, couldn't be more necessary in the climate, the current climate. I have to confess that I'm probably the least qualified on this panel, although I'm a political scientist, Professor of European Politics at King's College, London, and my research has focused really on civil society in post-communist countries. However, in the last 6 months, I've had a almost monumental shift, and I've been working on an ESRC-funded project, Economic and Social Research Council-funded project, looking at pro-EU activism here in the UK. And this has basically involved me going up with a couple of researchers up and down the country, interviewing grassroots pro-EU activists, typically Manchester for Europe, London, Liverpool for Europe, Bristol for Europe, and various others. And we're interested in their discourse, their activism, how they conceptualize and frame their support for Europe. So that's what I bring to the table in terms of my academic background, and I certainly found that video fascinating. But I will speak for the least time, and I will begin really because I think we did a quick conferring of, I think we're probably all saying something very similar. But I will begin with a few what I think really are introductory and perhaps a little bit provocative comments, because I remain steadfastly and determinedly optimistic. So I'll begin with a few comments and then hand over first to Dr. Madeline Ward and then to Jonathan. So what are my thoughts? Well, I think it's impossible to deny that we are living through what's perhaps best described as a sort of illiberal backlash. Wherever we look, there are populists, there's populism, there seems to be a tidal wave of far-right politics and politicians that seem to have captured not just electoral support, but a popular discourse and a dominant discourse. But I think the power that they've captured, both literally in terms of the seats, but also in the power of their rhetoric, is woefully exaggerated. And I think there's a high degree of shock and awe that masks a sort of paralysis or a scrambling round of those on the liberal left or the centrist politics or non-populists to counter some of that rhetoric. I think we were far too optimistic and naive about the transformative power of democracy, for example, in Eastern Europe. We rather lazily believed that, you know, if Hungary and Poland and Czech Republic and Slovakia established democratic institutions that consolidated, we use the language of consolidation, and once they became EU member states, that politics almost wouldn't take place, that the business of politics, the illiberal versus the liberal, the right, the left, the racism, the anti-racism, was not going to in any way characterize their politics moving forward. I think here in the UK and in other mature democracies, we were very lazy and complacent in defending the liberal values that we're now so desperate to highlight as so essential. I think we fail to stand up for core values and principles, and I think we took so much of that for granted. If anything, if we're going to find good in Brexit, in Trump, in Farage, in Orbán, and the list goes on and on and on, then we have to see it as a wake-up call. It is toning us up. It is waking us up. In answer to the actual questions posed here and the focus of tonight's discussion, I think, again, it's undoubtedly the case that Brexit has profoundly damaged community relations. You know, most of us, I believe, you know, work or live in London. We live in communities that are really at the the coal-face. They're the communities that are going to be most damaged by the pernicious politics of Brexit. How has it been damaged? Well, it's been damaged because there's been a legitimation of othering, a defining those who belong and those who don't belong, who has the right to be here as a citizen and those who should either have some kind of half measure of citizenship or indeed just should go. It has lent credence to the notion of immigration as being wrong and a political mistake of the Labour governments of the 1990s and 2000s. Of course, despite the huge benefit that immigration has brought to our country. Worst of all, it has ushered in a new form of politics, a lack of accountability, no regard for facts, expertise, and a really damaging populist rhetoric of which we're all familiar. More broadly, Brexit has questioned our belonging to Europe, by which I mean not just travel and all the other perks and benefits of EU membership that, of course, are important to us. But what I mean is its treaties, its historic treaties, its founding principles and values. It's the painful part for me is this questioning that we're not actually fully part of that story and that history. When, of course, if you know anything, I've taught European politics for many, many years, and Britain played such a key and fundamental instrumental role in shaping both Europe and European community and European Union in recent years. One sad fact that keeps coming back to me all the time in these discussions is somebody at the Commission pointed out to me that up until the day after the referendum, Britain led every single trade negotiation. It was a critical player in all of the EU's external relations, whether it be enlargement, trade relations, all of these sorts of things. And of course, since then, we've faded into the background. So in many respects, the damage has been done. But are we more divided as a consequence of Brexit? And I think that is a serious question to ask. I think the divisions are more a consequence of a decade of austerity, more than a decade of austerity. There's the widening gap between rich and poor, reflected in health statistics, in life expectancy, in all sorts of measures. In many respects, the Brexit debate has become proxy for such divisions. It's provided a political narrative for social economic tensions and allowed people to express their anger and frustration. Now, that's not offered in any way as mitigation. But the idea of not understanding or contextualising, I think it's very important to contextualise Brexit in that way. Yes, there's a rise in hate crime, racist attacks, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. It's all absolutely horrific. But does it reflect a more divided society or a small section of society, an abhorrent section of society, you may say, that now feels it is acceptable to express hatred and engage in violence? In other words, that they have been legitimised. And we can blame both politicians on the left and right for that. I think we need to remind ourselves that despite what looks like Britain's political crisis and turmoil and absolute, unmanaged decline, I think the reality is that our two main parties are still dominant, and they're still dominated by politicians of the centre-left, centre-right. There is still, if you take the majority of Labour MPs, the majority of Conservative MPs, there is very little between them on the main political issues of the day. Our two-party system is arguably stronger now than it was 5 years ago, and has proved to be pretty damn resilient. It doesn't mean that, if an election were called tomorrow, that we wouldn't have a minority government or whatever, but actually the two parties are probably, the two-party system is probably pretty much still intact. As I said at the beginning, and round up my comments, there are positives. My own research has indicated that for the first time in our certainly recent history, and certainly first time since we joined what was then the EEC, Britain has a grassroots pro-EU movement. There are people on the streets of even Sunderland, deepest, darkest Brexit country, Saturday mornings in hail and rain, shine, whatever the expression is, defending Europe. and defending the principles and values of Europe. Yes, you can say, well, there are only a handful of people, but there's signatories, there's support, there's rallies, there's marches. Of course, we've all seen through through London. So people are finding their voice. Every single person, sadly, that we interview as part of our research who are involved, 99.99% of the time says, we ask, when did you become active? It was the day after the referendum. I woke up and was so horrified. I felt ashamed, I felt embarrassed, I felt angry, I felt isolated. You know, you could be very depressed by that and think, well, where the heck were they the day before or a week before or a month before? But at least they have been galvanised, they've been mobilised. And that is a positive. We are beginning the discourse, the defence of Europe and its values and the importance of it. And that's why I'm convinced that if another referendum were held, I feel very positive that the outcome would be to remain. I think it's also important to look for data and for statistics. I did a quick trawl, but not extensively. But apart from the rise in isolated incidents, and there are instances, there's no significant evidence that community relations, talking about relations between communities, have actually got worse. So here's my to end this really, the prediction, the looking forward. I think liberal politics and politicians will regain electoral prominence. We already see an anti-populist backlash across Europe, Slovakia, Turkey at the weekend, the Czech Republic at the weekend. Citizens across Europe are protesting, they're agitating, they're defending tolerance of liberal values, of migrants, they're supporting migrants. We even saw that 3 or 4 years ago during the migrant crisis. And then we look over the Atlantic. I was in the US for a couple of weeks in May. The Democratic Party is experiencing a reawakening of community organising, of political debate, of genuine political dynamism, which was perhaps unimaginable during the last few years. So I think if there's one lesson to be learned, it's that populists and right-wing nativist politicians destroy themselves. I'm an absolute ardent defender of dialogue and free speech, and I oppose no platforming. And I think if we ever needed the evidence, put these awful people in front of media and cameras and let them tell the viewers and expose the folly of their politics. Liberal politics needs to be defended. It needed to be much more robustly defended than it was in the past. But its institutions are far more resilient and embedded than I think sometimes we convince ourselves they are. So I'll leave it there. And I hope I haven't contradicted or ruined anything that anybody, either you, Madeline, or Jonathan are going to say. But over to you, Madeline.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I'm from an organisation called Theos, which is looking at the role of religion in society. So that's what I'm mainly going to be talking about. I'm particularly leading on a project looking at how churches foster social cohesion. Now, that is an 18-month project. We're going to speak to about 400 participants, and we've spoken to about 3/4 of them already. That's only in England, so I'm not going to comment on the situation beyond that. And all of the data so far, although there is more to come, was collected before the EU elections. So I know that this event was in relation to the EU elections, but just to sort of caveat that this is all pre that. So I'm going to talk about how we might view the current situation in our communities, and then draw on Theos research to think about some solutions and also lessons from how churches do it. So I want to begin by acknowledging that for some the impact of Brexit has undeniably been negative. So even in our own research, we have heard of Eastern European shopkeepers having their businesses vandalised, BME participants feeling stigmatised because of the result. And I really think we have to say that that mustn't be downplayed. However, assessing the lasting trends that underlie those incidents is difficult. So for a start, while numbers of hate crimes reported to the police have risen steadily over the last few years, and had peaks around notable events, including the referendum, Actually, the crime survey, which is a randomly selected and representative sample of 50,000 households, suggests that numbers of people identifying as victims of hate crime have actually gone down in the same period. So there seems to be some conflicting evidence there, and it implies that part of the rise is at least in terms, can be understood in terms of a shift in the culture of reporting. Similarly, Professor Anthony Heath argued in 2018 that social cohesion has not actually been substantially corroded even over the last 50 years, when judged quantitatively according to measures like general levels of trust in other people and a sense of national belonging. So quite a surprising picture, I think. But it's consistent with Theos's own research too. So one of the questions we ask, which is relevant to this discussion, is your area moving closer together or further apart? Now, of the answers we've so far analysed, just over half of participants actually answered neither. And of the remaining participants, about half answered closer together and the other half further apart. Only 8 participants have mentioned Brexit at all in the answer to that specific question. And 2 of those actually judged that their communities were moving closer together despite Brexit. Far more often, participants raise specific and systemic factors as the main issues impacting their local areas. So that's the sense of being left behind, cultural and language barriers between groups, youth violence, economic deprivation, inequality. In other words, it seems that our actual local experiences are still primarily shaped by forces that predate 2016. Now, these problems are problems, nonetheless, but local communities seem to be pretty resilient. And yet, as one of our participants in Middlesbrough reflected, the high Brexit vote in this area was a reaction to poverty and the isolation that communities here might feel from Westminster. I saw people queuing up at polling stations, and the strange thing was a lot of them were angry. They were coming out to vote and they were angry. I've never noticed that before in an election. I think it was a frustration and they wanted to lash out. Now, to this end, the author David Goodhart has identified a socio-cultural divide in Britain between what he calls anywheres and somewheres. Now, anywheres tend to be university educated, and their identity is based on personal achievement, which means it's portable, and they feel comfortable in a wide range of situations. In contrast, somewheres tend to be more strongly communitarian, and they root their sense of identity and belonging in places. Now, these groupings exist on a spectrum, but Goodhart views our current political moment essentially as a somewhere backlash against anywhere overreach, which I think chimes with what you were saying. It's this kind of backlash moment. Now, I think this model contains a great deal of truth, but I think it's worth noting that in an increasingly internet-dependent and transient society, that actually we all rely less on what is local for our sense of community. And even somewheres aren't immune from that. I don't think somewheres are even trying to be immune from that. So the Leave identity has been shaped and entrenched by virtual spaces just as much as the Remain identity. In fact, notoriously so through the use of targeted adverts on Facebook. And this means that more than ever, our view of community is filtered through external and ideological lenses. So consequently, there was recently a survey of council leaders and mayors asking what the impact of Brexit had been on their communities. And actually, the proportion identifying a negative impact varied as much as 44 percentage points based on the political affiliation of the person being asked, not just on their region, which really suggests that we're not neutral observers of our communities at all. So in the Conservative respondents, it was something like 37% negative impact, and in Independents, it was 80% negative impact, which is quite striking. So comparing that to what we've said about the local picture, it seems that modes of community building which are most contested at the moment, that's the virtual and ideological ones, are the ones that we're actually pushing to the fore of our national debate. And the ones that seem most resilient, the local, are the ones that maybe aren't spoken about and sort of valued less, basically. So where do we go from here? Above all, I think we need to recognise that local connection is not the preserve of a somewhere tribe. Rather, it can be grounding and healing for everybody, insofar as it helps us to focus on common experiences and shared approaches to the challenges we face, rather than fundamentally different worldviews. As one participant reflected, social cohesion is about being honest about the world. That it isn't just my own little bubble and my own interpretation, It's about providing spaces, helping communities be places where difference doesn't have to be a barrier to flourishing. And this is where the Theos research, I think, comes in, because I think churches actually do offer quite a good model of doing this. It's a sort of form of community building which is encouraging exactly what that participant was talking about. And we can learn from it regardless of our religious background. So I'm going to go through just a few ways in which I think that's the case. I'm going to talk about churches because that's what we've been looking at, but I think a lot of this actually holds true across the faith sector. So how do they do that? Most obviously in a practical sense. So for a start, churches provide a huge number of physical meeting spaces. So there's a scheme called the Places of Welcome scheme, which basically encourages people to register that they will open up their buildings at the same time each week, have someone in them and provide refreshments. And so far, 78 of the current venues are connected to a faith community. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. So Theos research in 2014 found that around 10 million adults in England had accessed a church or church-based service in the last 12 months. And that could either be in a formal social space, so mums and tots groups, or it could be a service that they simply can't get elsewhere, like a food bank or a debt advice centre. These services obviously wouldn't run without people, and churches also generate large numbers of volunteers. This encourages grassroots confidence, a sense of moral direction, and above all, hope, which is in short supply sometimes in our current political climate. And also the paid time of official religious leaders, which comes with all sorts of benefits which are obvious, but perhaps less obviously. Often those leaders are called upon to convene spaces between other people as well in ways where otherwise that communication just isn't happening, particularly where there's a crisis. So after the Croydon riots, for example, the church convened basically the kind of community focus group on that. So all this means that churches are often connecting with their communities in ways that other organisations actually struggle to emulate. And they're a sort of capillary level of a community, so they get to places that often other people can't. So those are the practical things, but I don't think it is actually just about practical contribution. More importantly, the ways that churches engage with community, I think, is really critical. So on the one hand, our church-based participants have commonly spoken of a deep care for the community. And of course, the mandate to love thy neighbour means that anyone who's simply present and happens to be your neighbour, in theory at least, is worthy of that care. Whether that always happens in practice, obviously, is a different matter. But it shouldn't therefore be filtered through any of the criteria that most of us employ in ordinary life. So there is that genuine local concern. But at the same time, that is framed by a wider vision which draws from and celebrates forms of identity which reach beyond the local, rather than undermining them. So everything that local churches do makes reference to something bigger, whether just simply the broader church itself or some sense of higher purpose. And I think the critical thing that we can learn from here is that there is a creative tension going on between the local and the universal, which actually cuts through that crucial anywhere, somewhere distinction, which I spoke about earlier. So finding models that allow us to do that in the way that the church is doing that enable us to opt out of the divisive choices of local, global, national, and try and encompass all of the ways in which humans create community at any one time, whilst not losing sight of the grounded and rooted congregation. So it holds in tension what otherwise risks becoming so unbalanced in Brexit Britain. So just to conclude, our communities, I don't think, are falling apart, but our conceptual communities are certainly colliding. And these models of relationship building have increasingly been pushed to the fore in our public life. This has been highly divisive, and we need to seek to bring or restore some kind of balance in this situation. And I think that local church engagement provides one such model by which we can do that. And we can think about how else we might do that, not in a church context, obviously. Crucially, by embedding itself within the local without diminishing the universal. I think we could do worse than to follow that lead.
Thank you very much, Madeline. I was very remiss as chair at the beginning. I should have introduced you properly. Dr. Madeline Ward, you are at Theos, which is a think tank on religion and society, but got your PhD from Walton College, was it? Wolfson College, Oxford. Okay, so now, Jonathan Fryer, you are at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where you teach cultural expression.
Indeed, which perhaps ought to be explained. It's essentially how societies express their religious and traditional values through the arts and through the way they organise society. But I should also say, perhaps of relevance to this event, that I'm also Vice Chairman of London for Europe, pinned my colours to the mast, and indeed was a candidate in the European elections recently.
Could we interview you after? No.
It's almost exactly 3 years since the EU referendum, and a large number of people in this country are either convinced Brexit has happened, or else are angry that it hasn't happened, or, if they're on the other side, are still hopeful that it never will happen, for a number of reasons. And I'll come back to that dichotomy or even three-way split towards the end of my remarks. I'd like first, though, to puncture a myth. A myth has been much discussed in the media in particular, that the EU referendum left the country divided. And yes, of course, the figures were very clear, almost half and half, but just with a little majority to leave. But I would argue, actually, what the EU referendum did was to show how much the country was divided. And this picks up on some things that the other two speakers have mentioned so far. Divisions of various kinds, of which attitudes to the EU were only quite a small element for many people. There was quite a high turnout, but many people were not voting on EU matters specifically. I've had countless people tell me that they wanted to show a rude gesture to David Cameron. They wanted to protest about how London dominates politics in this country, or a surprising number who've told me, well, I thought it would be a good laugh to vote to leave, and weren't really quite sure what they were doing. But there are real divides in British society, and the EU referendum has in fact highlighted that those divides are there. For example, between cities and rural areas and small towns. It's often been mentioned of a north-south divide, but it's not as clear as that. Manchester, Sheffield, Liverpool, all voted Remain. And of course, so did Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it's by no means necessarily a geographical division, but a very real division between those who have succeeded in cities and enjoy city life and enjoy multicultural societies, and those who have been marginalised from the way that society has developed. There was an interesting piece published just a few weeks ago contrasting the situation between people living in the centre of Manchester and those who lived in Oldham, just outside Manchester, and how they perceived the way that society had developed. And those who lived in the centre of Manchester were saying things have got just so much better, and there are these new opportunities, and it's a wonderful city these days, which it certainly wasn't when I grew up there 50 years ago. Whereas those in Oldham were feeling angry that they had missed out on this, and that their local community was, as far as they were concerned, getting worse, getting poorer, fewer opportunities, and seeing more and more young people leaving to go to Manchester or to other cities, indeed to come here to London. And of course, the referendum did highlight what Adam spoke of, really, the sense of focusing on the other, the us and them, and then to a certain extent demonising the other, so that anyone who is not completely like yourself then becomes, if not exactly a target, though that is the case in the worst examples, nonetheless something that you compare yourself against, and therefore you can vent your frustrations on the other person rather than actually looking in on yourself, perhaps, to work out whether you could have done something about it yourself. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this does have very worrying echoes of the 1930s unless something is done to avoid that sense of the other and the demonization of the other. And I mentioned that I didn't think everyone was voting in the referendum about the EU. In fact, the lack of knowledge about the EU in this country was quite extraordinary. And that's the fault of successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, who never, even when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, sold the British membership of the EU. It was always everything good is British, everything bad is what Brussels is trying to do for us. And therefore, few people in this country knew much about the EU, and it was a very telling fact that the day after the EU referendum, the most common Google search in this country was, "What is the EU?" Perhaps it would have helped if they'd done it 2 days earlier, but they didn't. Now, this has resulted, the referendum, the post-referendum tensions, and I would put it as strong as that, there are real tensions in our society at the moment, not just between Remainers and Leavers, but between different groups, some of whom are lining up behind one camp or the other. This has contributed to huge damage to political discourse in this country, which has been devalued. Now, of course, it's not an entirely British phenomenon, and therefore we can't blame it totally on Brexit, because we've seen the same thing happen over in the United States and in some other countries on the continent. But Brexit certainly made things worse, where people increasingly question the difference between truth and lies and are prepared to argue alternative facts, which any academic would, of course, shoot down in flames, but is increasingly part of political discourse. We've also seen damage to Parliament, and that I find very worrying. I mean, I'm not a fan of referenda, and indeed this country doesn't have a long tradition of referenda, quite rightly, because we are a representative democracy and we elect members of the House of Commons, who in principle then make our laws and take many of the decisions on our behalf. Referenda were used for devolution in Scotland and Wales, and of course to confirm our membership of the then EEC in 1975, and 3 years ago to, as David Cameron would have hoped, to reconfirm, but actually it did the opposite. But of course didn't take us out. We're still not out. And indeed I would argue that we're no nearer an exit unless we actually crash out on the 31st of October, which is what many Conservatives have argued publicly, though whether they would go through with it is quite another matter. And what we also saw in the European elections last month was an extraordinary polarisation, which was, yes, around membership of the EU. But if we look at what it did to the political landscape, and here I would differ respectfully to something that Adam said earlier, because Adam said that we haven't seen the end of two-party politics. And yes, if you look at the 2017 general election, it seemed to have gone back to two-party politics. More than 80% voted for Conservatives or Labour. But that absolutely was not the case on the 23rd of May this year, where we saw polarisation with both of the main parties falling badly back. Polarisation to Brexit party on one side and the Liberal Democrats / Greens on the other, which had very clear messages. Brexit or stop Brexit, which is the polite version of the Liberal Democrat slogan. And that polarisation seems to be continuing, but at the same time, there is fragmentation. It's been fascinating watching opinion polls over the recent weeks. There was another one yesterday, and 4 parties were around 20%. Plus or minus a couple of points. So not necessarily in this order. let's do it alphabetically, Brexit, Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat, all on about 20% each, which could, under our first past the post system, produce the most peculiar results, and is certainly perhaps a good argument for change in our electoral system at some stage. So I think we've got, as I say, a certain polarisation on one hand, but also at the same time fragmentation, which is politically very unstable indeed. And that instability will come to a head if, as is increasingly being rumoured in Westminster, that there will be an election, a general election, in October this year, i.e. just before the date that in principle Britain is going to leave the EU. And this apparently is being mooted by the Johnson camp in the leadership campaign of the Conservatives, and is certainly being considered very seriously by the various political parties as a possibility, in a sense as an opportunity to perhaps in some cases to ask for an extension to the withdrawal period again, say, well, we're going to have a general election, so we can't possibly leave on the 31st of October. Please let us have more time to try and sort ourselves out. Or to organise another referendum. And I think the chance of a second referendum is increasingly likely. And of course, a lot of the debate at the moment in the Labour Party in particular is about, should there be a second referendum, which is what a majority of members of the Labour Party want, though not necessarily the leadership. And if that referendum happened, what would it be? It would not just be a rerun of June 2016. It would have to offer a plan, whether it's the May deal or something else. Jeremy Corbyn still seems to hope that he can negotiate an exit deal, though Brussels has been quite clear that that is not on the table. Who knows? And will there be a Remain option? Which therefore means that we are going to have, right through the summer and into the autumn, continued instability, continued debate about Brexit, and still no clearer sign, and I think this will happen well into October, whether Brexit is going to happen, and if so, when, and how it would happen, and how many years of transition we would then go into, and what that transition would be, because it could go on for decades before we actually come to some sort of new arrangement, which would mean that it wouldn't really be Brexit at all. But to end on perhaps an optimistic note, as Adam wanted to start off on an optimistic note, although I feel that society has been fragmented and polarised, and that there are symptoms of worrying demonisation of the other, and therefore serious negative conclusions for community cohesion, I do believe there is one principle or observation that could be usefully worked in the sorts of work that many of you in this room are involved in. We talk about identity so much in our society, all the more so because we are now such a varied multicultural society, not least here in London. But we can all have many layers of identity and be perfectly happy with having many layers of identity. And therefore, instead of seeing people superficially by what might be the first, most outward sign of identity, whether it's ethnicity or religious or whatever, perhaps the way forward is to really work on this whole idea of layers of identity and being able to react to people in a much more profound way by acknowledging those different layers, rather than focusing on the first and apparently obvious difference, because the more you look at people's different layers, the more we have in common.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Very good point on which to end. I'm glad we disagreed over something, otherwise it wouldn't have been a very good value panel.